What's up, Fantasy League enjoyers? We've had a bit of a reality check, haven't we? Top 10 to top 55, quite a turnaround. I just backed the wrong teams ultimately, and even then, within the wrong teams, I backed the wrong players. Brokey had a stinker. He was really rough. One of the worst performances I've seen from him that I can really recall. Really dragged Faze down, in all honesty, and it was very disappointing to see. From my perspective, minus 14 points kind of tells the tale, doesn't it? I thought Faze would have enough firepower, they'd have enough experience, especially as they're moving into a crowd atmosphere at the Lanxess Arena, a place that Faze have been multiple times and saw never have, that would be a bit of a determining factor, but it wasn't. I also thought that Snacks and G2, who smashed Spirit, who smashed Pain in really one-sided games, would have a higher chance of beating Mouse, but it just goes to show that Mouse are legit as hell, the real deal, as we already knew, and that 50-50 choice between Snacks and Shuey backfired as he got my minus 6 points. The only team that really performed for me was Na'Vi, and they went through to the finals after beating Mouse. Obviously, they had a bye to the semis, so I was guaranteed points anyway. But they went 3-1 against Vitality, a lot of overtimes. I think when they lost the Mirage performance game, though, and they choked just a little bit, I think their spirit was broken, and Vitality just used that momentum to cruise through to a fairly straightforward 3-1 win in the end. Bit had a very poor nuke game. He was 1-12 or 1-11 at one stage with 17 ADR. The worst performance I've seen from him in quite some time. And I was really scared about that one. But they managed to somewhat salvage it for me. I got some points out of this. Wasn't great. If 55% is the worst I do this season, I would be very happy with that. So we're going to just go in that full copium and look at it that way in a positive light. Additionally, as a bit of solace, I am joint 10th with Maniac. That's not a bad place to be, is it? Like, one of the best analysts on the planet, and we're joint with him. So we'll just say everything's okay. It's still easily able to be turned around. Blast Premier Full Showdown. The reason that you guys are here is an interesting one in the sense that it is very cutthroat. There is no second chance, no safety net, no opportunity if you lose to bounce back and get some success. That's scary from a fantasy league perspective. And so I think going for picks that you feel are more ironclad to get you some wins here is probably the play. But even with that, in that context, it's not that easy because there's a lot of very good teams here. Should also mention, I'm actually going to be casting this event. It's my first proper Blast event casted since the very first one they did back in 2017. I was casting with Vendetta on the C stream. They did this really interesting thing where they had 3 separate streams at once, and we were all on stage. It was a really cool experience, and this is my first event since then, so I'm super happy and grateful to be given this opportunity to cast alongside Jackie. We're both super excited about this and can't wait to get involved in it. So I've been doing a lot of preparation for it, and on top of that, I've been a part of pretty much the entire process for some of these teams. I got a chance to cast 2 qualifiers for this game, see Metasport make it through in their qualifier and Zero Tenacity make it through in theirs back at the Rest Masters months and months ago, where I believe, if memory serves me correctly, they beat DMS 2-1 in the finals. Russian team that had a lot of talent on it, very interesting squad. So I feel pretty good about my knowledge on Zero Tenacity and Metasport. And so we'll start with those 2 teams first, because I think a lot of people are going to be looking at them like, who? Who are these guys? Especially if you only watch Tier 1 events. So Metasport is a Swedish team. They managed to make it through their qualifier, but it was a really strange one. Their IGL AWP, Jaquinho, who some of you probably have heard of, because he was kind of Metasport's main player. Everything revolved around him, obviously, as an AWP IGL typically does. And he dropped out halfway through the qualifier. At first, we thought it was just illness or something like that, but it turned out he actually did leave the team. And it came out on HLTV afterwards. He did due to personal reasons, and he wanted to work on his mental health. And so, wish him all the best. All the best to you. Hopefully, a speedy and a happy recovery on that one. Lumi was the player that stepped in, an AWP player. Not entirely sure where the IGLing is coming from this team right now. They're a team in transition, you could argue, but Lumi has stepped in for them several times before, and he did step in during this tournament. And it was a real interesting one again, because the first game we played, Jackie and I were sat there. We said this to each other in the break, because you don't want to say this live because it's kind of disrespectful, right? But it looked like he just got out of bed. Like he was very uncomfortable on the server. You could see his movement wasn't there. His aim was all over the place. Like, he was just clearly really struggling on the server. And it wouldn't surprise me if he literally had just got out of bed, because everything happened so quick. We had very little time to prepare for him replacing Jaquinho, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same for Metisport, the way he looked in the first game. But the important thing to mention is, as he warmed up, his first map was a stinker. After that, he was really solid. He dropped a couple of 30s. He was lightning with the AWP, really good with rifles as well, and his pistol work was solid on top of it. So this is an exciting player. Alongside him, Plopsky, some of you would have heard of him, obviously, previously at teams like NIP. He was very aggressive on this team. He's very much like an entry fragger type. He felt like a kind of a callback, a throwback to some of the entry fragging that I remember seeing Apex play, and some of these other entry fraggers from that era, where it was like you were just an entry fragger. And it was back in a time with Counter-Strike where like roles felt like they were very much set in stone. Now everyone's kind of a bit of a hybrid of everything, apart from maybe IGLing and AWPing. But he is a very strong, aggressive player on CT or T side, and I think CS is in a place right now where that's really available to players, because you have to get maps like Ancient, where being aggressive is very easy. Dust 2, Anubis is another one. Like, pretty much the whole map pool, you can be aggressive on CT side. And so that lends itself very much to Plopsky. And then Adam B is this really good anchor player. Mirage in particular, he plays B side Mirage, and he landed clutch after clutch after clutch. One of the reasons Metisport are at this tournament is the amount of clutches they got in the finals. It was insane. Nilo is their most mechanical sort of rifler, the guy that you're looking at to post up the big numbers, as you can see reflected in the stats. So this is a very exciting team, and unfortunately, it is a pretty big blockade. They're against Complexity. Complexity, I've said for a long time, are an inconsistent team, and I would argue the case for that being correct, but that's against tier 1 top flight teams, your G2s, your Phases, although Faze, we'll get back into them in a second, the Na'Vis, these kind of teams where when they play against the very top opposition, they struggle, they have up and down performances. Maybe Elige is dropping 25 and everyone else is struggling, or maybe Elige has an off game and they don't really have the firepower. But one thing Complexity typically do is they smash teams that they should be smashing. They're very consistent at beating teams below them, and I think unfortunately for Metisport, they're running into a bit of a brick wall in Complexity. So I don't fancy their chances. Zero Tenacity, I'll quickly touch on them in a bit more detail, and then we'll get through the rest into my picks. Brook Monster's their AWPer, a play looking out for. He had a couple of very slow starts in the rest Masters, and I was a bit worried about his AWPing. Honestly, especially on Mirage, he had a couple of very slow starts where he started like 1 and 7, but very tenacious player. And he was able to bounce back and actually land 25 plus kills on both maps, so he had terrible starts. The Mania is their rock solid sort of rifling prospect, similar to Nilo, mechanically very good. Also a pretty aggressive player on top of that one, so watch out for him. And then Kajofo was putting in some big clutches. So another impressive and very interesting team, which I think is going to go under the radar a little bit. I personally think that Zero Tenacity have a better chance of beating VP than Metisport have against Complexity, because this ZT team, honestly, is pretty damn good, but they've had a lot of up and down performances. I'll show you real quick that how up and down their games have been ever since they qualified. So trailing wins, you know, Game of Legion they lose to, fair enough. Game of Legion are a decent team. Winning against Eyeballers, losing to 3D Max and Sangal, and Eyeballers again, getting a bunch of wins, losing to Favbet, losing to 9 Pandas, Aurora, Youth Blood, crazy name. Passion UI they lost to as well. So they're really going back and forth. But what you'll notice about these teams is none of them are top flight opposition. None of these teams realistically are on VP's level. So this is a big step up. This is a very big step up in opposition, in quality. And so although I think ZT probably have a better chance of beating VP than Metisport do against Complexity, I still think VP are the favorites. And then big in Game of Legion, honestly, I think Game of Legion probably win that game. But I'm not really blown away by either of these rosters right now. I think Game Legion are a better team. Big, Searson's still struggling with the AWP. He's still not landing sort of consistency. Rigon, I thought, was a very good pickup. Him and JDC definitely do carry the bulk of this team. But it doesn't fill me with confidence. And I think VP, realistically, should be making semis. They're a team themselves that are having problems, but none of the opposition they could possibly face are top 10 contenders, top 15 contenders. And so these are typically where VP should be shining if this team actually wants to make a real case for themselves come the next major of being a legit threat. So I'm looking at VP here. Falcons, I think, beat M80, although M80, this German-American combination with depth, so they've got like German-American and English within them, is a really interesting prospect. Like, I think M80, they're a good team, man. They are a decent team, a good outfit. So I couldn't say categorically that Falcons win this game. I could see it being a 2-1, a bit of a sweaty game, a bit of a nail-biter for Falcons. It's why I'm not sure if I want to go for Falcons. And then even if they do beat M80, you're probably against Complexity in the next round. That's kind of terrifying. Complexity and Falcons here, more than likely. In the top half, you could even argue the top half is more stacked than the bottom half is. You got some very interesting games here. Amcal against NIP. This isn't the Amcal from the RMRs. This isn't the roster, the core roster of like Crad and Forrester and Travis that we've seen playing together multiple times in the past. You can see as well there is one glaring problem with this. They have Topo, who's not really up there in terms of stats, but they also have a TBD, and that's not his name. He quite literally don't have a fifth player right now as they're coming into the tournament, which is terrifying because you're looking at a potential substitute to play in a LAN of this size, and you're against NIP in the first game, and this is NIP that have been looking like they're actually picking up the pace a little bit. Wrinkle, this amazing Ukrainian talent with the AWP. Rez has been playing so much better as well. And then although Isaac and Alex are towards the bottom end, obviously Alex is their IGL and Isaac's more of their supportive player, they have a lot of firepower on this team, so I don't really fancy Amcal's chances. I'm looking at NIP here. Heroic and OG, Heroic are definitely the better team. I don't think there's any real doubts about that one, but there are problems with Heroic. You know, Dex has had continual visa issues. He's not performing great even when he is playing 1.03. I would imagine there's probably a lot of stresses and anxieties for him behind the scenes, which will always affect a player's performance. And although TSS in particular has really been popping off, it's a team that has a lot of potential, a lot of talent, but isn't quite finding their fifth gear. It always feels like this Heroic team is kind of hamstrung in some way, whether that's because of themselves, whether it's because of visa issues or whatever else. And I expect them to beat OG, but I could see NIP beating them and securing their spot in the semis. Sorry, excuse me. On the other side, you've got Faze, Rare Atom, Cloud9, and Pain. This is a tough one as well, because if you showed me this bracket like 3 months ago, like, oh, it's Faze, like it's Faze all day, every day. This is easy for Faze, and it still might be. But this Faze is, they're in a struggle town, man. Like, they're really having a rough one right now. Not just because they lost to Saw. This isn't a knee-jerk reaction like, oh, they lost to Saw. They still made the playoffs. They made the quarterfinals. It's the fact that they have looked so off, and every game seems to be a struggle. Every game seems to be down to nail biters, down to these clutches, down to these crazy calls and reads, and these individual moments and efforts. Rops has had a couple of like reinvigorated performances where I've wanted to believe in him again, but then he's been off. And Brokey's had a couple of really poor performances. Frozen's level has dropped a little bit. A lot of talk with this team of like being really down and like feeling really burnt out and really not, you know, feeling optimal about their position right now. There's so many problems with this Faze roster. It just doesn't fill me with confidence at all, to be honest with you. And here's another thing. I'm not saying I think this is going to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did. If they crash out of this tournament and they go on a bit of a rough string of games, is a roster change possible with Faze? I don't want to be tinfoil hat, and I certainly don't want to be pushing this narrative, but I wouldn't be surprised in the lead up to the next major if things continue like this. Something has to change, right? And maybe it's their own play style. Maybe they try different roles. They try a different way of calling. We've heard that from Carrigan as well. But things can't keep going on like they've been, because this is not the Faze that we're used to seeing. Now, I still, with all of those things being said, expect them to beat Rare Atom. And honestly, I expect them to make it through to the semis. I expect them to make it through to the semifinals. I don't see how any of these teams realistically beat them. Cloud9, they've gone through roster changes. They have a very interesting core lineup, and now they've had enough time as well to gel together a little bit better. My issue is with a bit of firepower, because Inters and Boomic themselves never going to be the heavy hitters. We know what Heavy God is capable of from his OG days, but that was against lesser opposition typically. We haven't seen him consistently pump out massive performances when it comes to tier 1. Icy, very solid AWP. I remember watching him back with Jackie at the RMRs. Exile, we know what this guy's capable of, right? You remember the days of Exile and Shiro terrorizing everybody. Is it too soon, though? And Pain's no scrub. Like, Pain as a team is no scrub whatsoever. They had a couple of heavy defeats in their previous tournament, you know, in Cologne, against G2 in particular, completely bodybagged them in that last game. But they also beat the Mongols. And this is the Mongols that took down some early scalps themselves. So I think this is a really interesting matchup. It's a bit of a 50-50 to me, honestly, on paper. But I would still fancy Faze to beat the winner of this regardless. So I'm going to say Faze make it through at the semis, but I do not feel confident about that whatsoever. So for me, I think the semis is going to be Faze versus NIP up here. And I would imagine Complexity will take on Virtus Pro down on the bottom one. So for those reasons, I have made the following team. Now, no Faze players. People are going to definitely be turning their nose up at that one. No Complexity players and no Heroic players. Kind of mad, I know, but let me show you why. Not just because of everything I've just described and explained to you there. Additionally, look at the prices on some of these players. And I understand why the prices are so high, because it is pretty top heavy in terms of the teams that you expect to do well. Brokey224, after the game that we just saw him play, after the performance we just saw from him in Cologne, minus 14 points he got me. 224? Madness. VP, pretty affordable, reasonable prices, like James 216, Norbert 191. I tried to get Fame in, but $8,000 was a pretty big difference. Complexity, there's one player that you look at Complexity and you're like, I have to have him on my team. That's a Liege with 228. I tried to make multiple squads and rosters that had a Liege in, and it just didn't work. I was having to go for 2 or 3 budget players because of it. Heroic, another team that is hot and cold. 209 for Nerds, 209 for Tesses, 213 for Dexter, which again, his recent ratings have not been that stellar. So you're noticing a lot of very expensive players on teams that should do well, but I can't justify that, especially when I'm not sure they're even going to make it, and my confidence has been shook for Faze. So I'm going to go for NIP and VP to make their respective semi-finals, and then I thought Snow as a bit of a gamble, a bit of a punt, because I was quite impressed with his gameplay, even though Pain were getting smashed. And more importantly, he was 188,000. He's the cheapest player on Pain. And if Pain get a win against Cloud9 and make moves and actually end up taking down like Faze as well, then any Pain players are going to be worth their weight in gold. So I felt pretty good about going for a bit of a gamble on him. But obviously, I'm mainly going behind either VP or NIP to make it the distance. I don't think many people are going to have this team. This could be a top 5% contender, and it can also be a top 95% contender, right? So we'll see what happens. I've took a bit of a gamble. I've took a bit of a risk on this one. But at the same time, I do feel pretty good about the picks for all the reasons I've just highlighted and discussed there in kind of like the lead up. So I know this has been a longer video. It's mainly because I've been like really nerding out on the stats and everything. I like to mix it up as well, go for some longer form videos and some shorter videos. And you guys can always skip to the end if you just want to see the team. That's always possible for you. So thank you very much for watching. Let's cross our fingers and hope for better than a top 55% team. But I feel like this is the kind of roster that is either going to be like a top flight contender, or I'm going to just completely crash and burn. Let's see what happens.